Hi. Good evening and welcome, everybody. I'm Rob van Vuren. I will be your host this evening, and on behalf of Stellenbosch University, I would like to extend a very warm welcome. Welcome to our third annual Social Justice Lecture. Also, a very warm welcome to our online audience who are joining us via Zoom. Thank you very much for joining us. A couple of notes to you guys. If you can keep yourselves on mute throughout, that would be fantastic. We will be engaging with you, especially in the Q&A, so please engage with us through the chat function on the Zoom meeting, and we will engage with you and incorporate you into the running of events. Thank you very much for joining us. Before we start off the evening's proceedings, I think I should just address the elephant in the room. I'm sure many of you are wondering how a comedian such as myself gets to host such an important lecture on such a layered and important and sensitive topic. And in fact, there was someone on social media, on Twitter today, who said, "Oh, great, just what we need. Twaki telling us how to live our lives." And I want to assure you that I would never, never presume to tell you how to live your life. I don't even know how to live my own life. So that is my solemn promise to you. I would never, ever do that and tell you how to live your life. I'm extremely pleased to be here today. It's a great pleasure. And I wanted also to assure you guys that I'm not here because of my knowledge and experience in the subject at hand. I'm here because of my 11-year-old daughter. I think I should qualify that statement. At the end of last year, I was lucky enough to host the gala dinner of the Amy Foundation, at which Prof. Thuli Madonsela was the guest of honor. And I decided to bring my 11-year-old daughter along to that function to give her a bit of insight into what Dad does, but also to show her how an organization like the Amy Foundation does incredible things to help make this country a better place. And she was seated at the table with the prof, and they hit it off famously. So I guess what I'm saying is the real reason I am here today and got this job is because Prof. Thuli Madonsela and my 11-year-old daughter are now besties. And I am totally down with that. And in fact, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you, Prof. Madonsela. Thank you so much. And I'd like to also thank my daughter, who is also now my agent and manager. Thank you very much, Bijou. Daddy loves you. Very, very much. As I said, it really is a great honor and a privilege to be here today, ladies and gentlemen. And I just want to get my notes before we begin. It is, oh, hang on. My thumb's gone all sweaty, so I can't open my thing. I want to take this opportunity before we begin, just to let you all know, please engage on social media, all of you online, as well as our audience in the room here today. Use the hashtag #SocialJusticeLecture and the hashtag Social Justice Day. If you don't know about the Wi-Fi, please jump onto the network STIAS2, STIAS2, password conference22 ! And then please engage with us. I'm very happy to be here. I must say, I'm very happy and honored to be here. And I'm happy and honored to be here for a number of different reasons, ladies and gentlemen. I'm happy because I'm a huge fan of the prof, the work that she has done, the work that she continues to do, and I will always be a fan, despite the fact that she likes my daughter more than me, and that's fine. I'm also happy to be here because, to be honest, after lockdown, I'm happy to be anywhere that isn't my lounge and that doesn't smell like another failed attempt at baking banana bread. I'm also very happy to be here and not have to pretend that I'm not something that I'm not. I can be honest with you guys and say I'm not an expert at what we're about to talk about. And that's good, because that was a difficult realization I had to make during lockdown. And I'm sure all of us have made difficult realizations during lockdown, some of us collectively. collective realizations, hard realizations. Like nowadays, you can't ask people the innocent question, "How are you?" Because they will tell you. They will tell you everything, and it's too much information. But there was a lot of pressure to be things that you weren't during this period that we've just been through. A lot of pressure to pivot, to find alternate sources of income. And I myself was a motivational speaker for a while during lockdown. And some of you might be surprised to hear that I was a motivational speaker. I myself did not know I was a motivational speaker until one afternoon when I discovered that motivational speakers make more money than stand-up comedians. So I thought to myself, I am a motivational speaker. Until I realized fundamentally at my core, my life's purpose is not to be a motivational speaker. And that's because I had run-ins with motivational speakers. In fact, I went to see a motivational speaker a few years ago, and I was going through a depression that I didn't quite realize I was experiencing at the time. And I saw this man talk, and immediately I thought to myself, now I really want to kill myself. Before I didn't know I was depressed. Now I knew exactly how depressed I was and why. Because this is one of those motivational speakers who'd done stuff with his life, guys, but unnecessary stuff. You know the kind of person I'm talking about. It's the kind of person who feels compelled to paddle to Madagascar and back in a boat made out of wet wipes with just like a tea strainer for an oar. What is wrong with these people? The man that I saw was a man who ran the entire length of the Great Wall of China, a distance which accumulatively amounts to more than 100 ultramarathons every day for more than 100 days. This idiot would get up and run an ultramarathon. He described how he lost all of his toenails within the first month. Some of his toenails literally jumped off of his toes just to get away from the running. And as I sat there listening to this man reel off this litany of incredible achievements against all odds and indeed even defying logic, I couldn't help but think to myself, what a bad idea. It sounds uncomfortable to be that awesome. And besides, you don't need to run everywhere. Get an Uber. I think that's at my core when I realized my life's purpose is not to be a motivational speaker. And I think my distaste for motivational speakers stems from the fact that there are so many snake oil salesmen out there right now trying to tell us to be better and to do better in a time where it's really difficult just to be. You know, I think as a country we deal with trauma in such a fleeting way. We're constantly moving from one crisis to the next. And I think there's a lot of people out there without a depth of knowledge of how to deal with trauma and how to process the trauma who are quickly summing up the meaning of life for us. And that I find kind of deeply troubling because, let's be honest, life is not an inspirational quote emblazoned across a sunsetted sky on Instagram. Life is way more complicated than that. It's, yes, we all seek the meaning of life. Yes, sure. We can see it off in the distance sometimes. Sometimes we can even reach out and try to grab it. Sometimes we can even grasp it in our fingertips, but we just can't pull it towards ourselves. That's life. It's like one of those paper towel dispensers in a public toilet, just that thin little sliver of paper toweling. Your hands are wet. All you want to do is dry your hands, but your wet fingertips keep coming away with bits and pieces of paper toweling. How are you supposed to dry your hands? It's not sustainable. So I think that is the real reason why I'm really excited to be here today, because I clearly have a fascination with trauma and how we process trauma and how we heal trauma. And I think there's in our society today, there's a lot of people who are offering quick fix solutions. People who haven't dedicated their lives to actually processing this kind of information. And today, we're in the presence of people who really have dedicated their lives to dealing with the issue of collective trauma and how we process and move on from that. So I'm extremely, extremely proud and extremely privileged to be in this company today and to say that I am not the expert and I don't need to talk anymore because we have people who will talk and who will share their knowledge with us. So thank you so much for having me here today. Thank you very much to our guest, Yasmin Suka. It's a wonderful privilege and an honor to have you here. You guys at home, please engage with us. Please ask the difficult questions. We welcome them, and we really want to get to the bottom of this and dig a little bit deeper into something that really deserves that kind of attention. That's enough from me. I think you've heard enough. I think what we're going to start off with now is the national anthem, and we're going to go straight into the preamble of the Constitution just to start off the event. So thank you very much. If you could please stand for the national anthem. Thank you.
Republic yomzantsi Afrika ka-1996 intshayelelo thina bantu basemzantsi Afrika siyaziqonda intswelo bulungisa zexesha lethu eladlulayo. Sinika imbeko abo beva ubunzima bebulaleka ngenxa yobulungisa nenkululeko elizweni lethu. Sihlonela abo bathi basebenzela ukwakha nokuphuhlisa ilizwe lethu kwaye sikholelwa ekubeni uMzantsi Afrika ngowethu sisonke thina bemi bahlala kuwo simanyene nangani singafani ngokobuhlanga. Kungoko sinabameli abonyulwa ngokukhululekileyo ukuba bawamkele lo mgaqo-siseko njengomthetho owongameleyo weriphabhlikhi ukuze ungcibe iyantlukwano yangaphambili ukuze wakhe uluntu olusekelwe kwinqobo ezisemgangathweni zedemokhrasi, ubulungisa kwezentlalo namalungelo abantu asiseko. Kumiselwe isiseko soluntu oluphila ngendlela yedemokhrasi nolwenza izinto elubala apho urhulumente esekelwe kwintando yabantu nalapho wonke ummi ekhuselwe ngokulinganayo ngumthetho ophucule ixabiso lokuphila kuba bonke abemi uze uvumele ukusebenza kwesakhono somntu ngamnye kanjalo. Wakhe uMzantsi Afrika omanyeneyo nonedemokhrasi onakho ukuthabatha indawo yawo efanelekile njengelizwe elinobunga kusapho lwezizwe ngezizwe. Wanga uThixo angabakhusela abantu bakowethu. Nkosi sikelela iAfrika. Morena buluko setjhaba sa Yesu. Nkosi South Africa. God bless South Africa. Modimo fa tutsetsa Africa. Hosi katekisa Africa.
Hello, my name is Daniela Takis and I'm 10 years old. I will be reading the preamble of the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa, 1996. We, the people of South Africa, recognize the injustices of our past, honor those who suffered for justice and freedom in our land, believe that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, united in the diversity. We therefore, through our freely elected representatives, adopt this Constitution as the supreme law of the Republic so as to heal the divisions of the past and establish a society based on democratic values, social justice and fundamental human rights, lay the foundations for a democratic and open society in which government is based on the will of the people and every citizen is equally protected by law, improve the quality of life of all citizens and the potential of each person, and build a united and democratic South Africa able to take its rightful place as a sovereign state in the family of nations. May God protect our people.
Goeiedag, ek is Christopher Kutsiembete en is 11 jaar oud. Ek lees die aanhef tot die grondwet van Suid-Afrika, 1996. Ons, die mense van Suid-Afrika, erken die ongeregtighede van ons verlede. Huldig diegene wat vir geregtigheid en vryheid in ons land gelei het. Respekteer diegene wat hul beywer het om ons land op te bou en te ontwikkel, en glo dat Suid-Afrika behoort aan almal wat daarin woon, verenig in ons verskeidenheid. Daarom neem ons deur ons vry verkose verteenwoordigers hierdie grondwet aan as die hoogste reg van die Republiek ten einde. Die verdeeldheid van die verlede te heel en 'n samelewing gegrond op demokratiese waardes, maatskaplike geregtigheid en basiese mensregte te skep. Die grondslag te lei vir 'n demokratiese en oop samelewing waarin 'n regering gegrondves is op die wil van die bevolking en elke burger gelyk deur die reg beskerm word. Die lewensgehalte van alle burgers te verhoog en die potensiaal van elke mens te ontsluit en 'n verenigde en demokratiese Suid-Afrika te bou, wat sy regmatige plek as 'n soewereine staat in die gemeenskap van nasies kan inneem. Mag God ons mense beskerm. Nkosi sikaleli iAfrika, morena buloka setjhaba sa Yesu. God seën Suid-Afrika. God bless South Africa. Modimo fatatshedza Afrika. Hosi katikisa Afrika.
Is that it? Are we going to do all 11 languages? I'm not sure. At this stage, I jumped the gun a little bit early there. That was the national anthem and the preamble to the Constitution. I heard some people in the audience who were a little bit worried that they were going to read the entire Constitution. No, it was just the preamble. Thank you very much. I also, to my shock, realized that I was singing with a microphone on my face. So I've never sung so quietly in my life. So I think I got that right. I also didn't want to be that white guy who got through the tricky second verse of Nkosi Sikelele and then clapped hard with the stem. That's not That wasn't what I was going for. Thank you so much all for... I'm glad someone enjoyed that joke. Thank you so much for coming. I'm really, really excited to be a part of this this evening and to welcome you all here. But it is not my job to welcome you. I would like to welcome onto stage the Dean of the Faculty of Law, Professor Nicholas Smit, who will welcome you officially. Professor Nicholas Smit, thank you very much.
Good evening, Program Director, and all the discouraged motivational speakers in the audience. It really is my pleasure to welcome everybody here, both our in-person guests as well as the audience that's joining us online. This is our third annual Social Justice Lecture, and it's actually quite difficult to think that we've already reached this point. Of course, if COVID hadn't undermined our program, things would have been different, but we are very happy to at least have some people in person here tonight. Hopefully by the end of the year, perhaps our public lectures may all be in person. Let's see what happens. The topic of restorative justice and restitution. It is a very important one, worldwide, but especially in our country. In fact, our university pledged a restitution statement in 2018, the centenary of the university, acknowledging its inextricable connection with generations past, present, and future, as well as its contribution towards the injustices of the past. And I quote, "For this, we have deep regret. We apologize unreservedly to the communities and individuals who were excluded from the historical privileges that SU enjoyed. And we honor the critical Māori voices of that time who would not be silenced. In responsibility towards the present and future generations, SU commits itself unconditionally to the ideal of an inclusive, world-class university in and for Africa." We are very blessed that in our faculty, we have at least 2 research chairs that focus on social justice and human rights. So other than our own Law Trust chair, occupied by Professor Tuli Maronsela, we also have colleagues working in the field of human rights. And in the broader university, we have people like Professor Pumla Koboro Marikesela, who holds the South African National Research Chair in Violent Histories and Transgenerational Trauma. Her work has a focus on the relationship between remorse and forgiveness and the role of empathy, which is very relevant to the topic tonight. Colleagues, friends, students, many different conceptions of justice exist. Amongst them, political, moral, religious. Some, like Rawls, start from a conviction that a constitutional democratic regime is a reasonable, just, and workable solution that is worth defending. The TRC in our context played a very important role in our constitutional democracy. And therefore, it is a great honor to welcome Jasmine. Welcome at Stellenbosch tonight. We are really looking forward to listening to your lecture. And I thank Professor Maronsela and the team for arranging this event, for making sure that we have such an esteemed guest speaker. I'm sure you will still be introduced, so I'm not going to recite all your backgrounds and history. But from my side, I want to thank you for joining us for this lecture tonight. And I also want to thank you for all your work over a long period of time upon which all of us should be building going forward. Thank you very much and welcome. There we go.
Prof. Nicholas Smit, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, Prof. Now it's time to bring our guest speaker onto stage. I have to read a little bit of your bio, I'm afraid. I know it's terrible. I know you're sitting there going, it's excruciating, I know. But I think for our online viewers, most of you guys have the program, so forgive me if I'm telling you information you already know, but for our online viewers, I think it's really important to understand the depth of knowledge and expertise of our speaker here today. So allow me to say that Yasmin Suka is a South African human rights lawyer and served as a commissioner on the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission appointed by President Mandela in 1995. She served as one of 3 international commissioners on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Sierra Leone, appointed by Mary Robinson. She currently chairs the Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan, established by the Human Rights Council in Geneva to investigate serious crimes in South Sudan and collect and preserve evidence for future accountability efforts. In 2011, Ms. Suka served as advisor to Ban Ki-moon, the then Secretary General of the United Nations, as a member of the panel of experts advising on accountability for war crimes in Sri Lanka. In 2015, she served on the Secretary General's panel investigating sexual exploitation and abuse by French peacekeepers in the Central African Republic. She also served as a member of the high-level advisory group on the Global Review of Resolution 1325. She is the former executive director of the Foundation for Human Rights in South Africa, where she served between 2011 and 2019. She is also an extremely good painter, poet, and boogie boarder. And that is just a little tidbit of this resume. This is a resume that is longer than I am physically as a human being. This is really just a little taste of the kind of work and dedication you've put into the work that you do. And your life is incredibly inspiring to us, and it is a great honor and a privilege to welcome you here today. Ladies and gentlemen, Yasmin Suka.
Unfortunately, while I'd love to be able to boogie board, and maybe you're going to give me lessons in doing that, I guess I would probably fall off it and embarrass myself very, very badly. But let me thank Tuli for inviting me to speak this evening on restorative justice and restitution, and also Professor Nicola for the very kind words. It was deeply moving to actually hear the university's pledge and acknowledgement of, it was really the question of taking of responsibility. And I think that as South Africans, that's something that we really need to have, to encourage. I do have a paper which I'll pass on to my host, but I'm going to try and confine my comments to around 35 minutes so that we have real engagement. But maybe some caveats. My perspectives are very much my own. They're based on my own personal experiences of transitional justice in South Africa and the countries that I worked on after that. So I touch on the negotiated settlement and the amnesty compromise encapsulated in the interim constitution, and you heard that being read, and really that facilitated the elections in South Africa and gave rise to democracy, constitutional democracy, but which also played the role of midwife to the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so I touch briefly on the history and genealogy and how it informed our choices. The South African Truth Commission, its restorative justice approach, but also its weaknesses, as well as the critique of its work, really focusing on the legacy of the socio-economic dimensions of apartheid, the legacy of which we live with today. I then will deal briefly with the work on the unfinished business, which has spanned more than 23 years, and of course the big political economy questions which confront all of us today. So this week, 40 years ago, on the 15th of February 2022, 4 student activists known as the COSAS 4 were lured into a trap by Askaris and a security branch operative into a trap. They were taken to a pump house in the Vaal. They were locked up and then blown up. One of them managed to escape, but he died last year. And the security branch officer who was responsible for supplying the electronic devices used to blow them up. Both him and one of the Askaris applied for amnesty and in fact alleged that they were acting on the instructions of their commanders at the security branch. But both of them were denied amnesty because they did not make a full disclosure in their amnesty applications. And last year, the two of them were indicted under international criminal law for murder as a crime against humanity. Unfortunately, despite this historic indictment, the first time in the history of South Africa, the Director General of the Police has denied Rorich's bid to have his legal fees paid by the state, contradicting earlier decisions taken that where security branch operatives acted on the orders of the state, they should have their legal costs carried. And of course, the evidence that is available out there confirms that they were not on a private frolic of their own, but actually they acted in pursuit of the objectives of the state. But this case is an example of one of the approximately 35 cases that is being supported by the Foundation for Human Rights as part of its unfinished business of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I'm very pleased to see the former deputy chair of the foundation, Judge Siraj Desai, present here today. South Africa's negotiated settlement in 1993 ended an internal armed conflict that had lasted for more than 350 years and conclusively ended the more than 3 decades rule by the apartheid government. There were no winners to this conflict, and it really posed critical questions to the negotiators on how to deal with the crimes of the past and heal a highly unequal nation with deep-seated racial, socioeconomic, legal, and political divides. And of course, as a young lawyer, as apartheid had been declared a crime against humanity by the United Nations in 1966, like many others, I anticipated that we would have Nuremberg's trials. And to the surprise of us all, this was not to be. And I think what you see then in South Africa is the evolution of an approach that has really guided world leaders on how to deal with post-conflict countries. So at midnight before the signing of the interim constitution, the liberation movements capitulated and agreed to an amnesty deal. This clause, of course, is reputed to be written by Andre Brink, and when you listen to it, it's absolutely beautifully written. In the human rights movement, of course, we were deeply disappointed to learn that the liberation movements had agreed to an amnesty for the crimes of the past and thought actually that they had sold us out. I recall phoning the late Dala Oma, who was a mentor to many of us young lawyers, and arguing that in fact they'd compromised the rights of victims. And Dala, needless to say, was very angry, and he said in his own calm, inimitable manner that we in civil society needed to decide whether we wanted to continue to scream and shout outside or whether we would actually assist the new government to ensure that the amnesty process did not become a bureaucratic one where it would all be held behind closed doors. And he said, if you really want to play a role, you need to create the space for us so that we protect the rights of victims and, in fact, the questions of the rule of law. And he explained that, in fact, that the apartheid generals were placing pressure on the late President de Klerk to negotiate a blanket amnesty for them. And this was being resisted. There were many in the liberation movements who argued, why don't we lock them up and throw the keys away? But there were equally others, military people on both sides, who said both sides had fought a war and that civilian casualties are a collateral, are part of the collateral damage of that war. And in my view, when I look back now, I wonder if that view is what has prevented prosecutions from taking place in our country. Dala Oma also said that the human rights lawyers, himself, Kader Asmal, and Albie Sachs were the ones who opposed the blanket amnesty and really should be credited with ensuring the conditions in which South Africa avoided complete impunity. Now, of course, the question of amnesties are controversial and generally prohibited under international law, particularly for what we call serious crimes. This is war crimes, crimes against humanity. And remember, apartheid was declared a crime against humanity, and of course, genocide. And when we go back to the work of the Nuremberg Tribunal, it's very clear that the attribution of responsibility to individual perpetrators is a fundamental task of justice after mass atrocity crimes. And there's a belief in the world that only if you punish individuals who commit such crimes can the law then be enforced. In our case, of course, even as we were discussing the TRC law, a debate was unfolding between Carl Nino, the advisor to the Argentinian president, and Diane Orentlicher, an American war crimes lawyer. And the debate was about settling accounts post-conflict. And it focused on this question of the international obligations of the state in dealing with serious international crimes. And Carl Nino, as President Aoun's advisor, had watched how Aoun almost lost power through a military coup when he tried to put the military commanders on trial. And he argued that what we need to take into account is the political context. And of course, Diane then had to concede this point. So when we were debating the TRC law in Parliament, and it took 1 year for this law to pass, these were some of the arguments that were being posed by different sides in that process. The late Kader Asmal, in a book he co-authored, noted, and he disagreed, that there's an international practice that you must prosecute. And he argued that, in fact, there was no international established practice, given the concern that prosecutions could destroy and destabilize a country. And he then went on to say that in South Africa, the interim constitution, under which the historic 1994 elections were held, contained an explicit coda, this is the post-amble, and warned the country against the risk of pursuing strategies of vengeance or victimization at the expense of the new country flourishing. And he argued that this was actually captured in the constitution by the African word Ubuntu, which implied both compassion and recognition of the humanity of the other. So there were a number of compromises that were made during the negotiations on the basis that these were necessary for a peaceful transition to democracy. It included a government of national unity, no nationalization of land, an amnesty deal for those responsible for the crimes of apartheid, and of course this trade-off, criminal accountability for truth recovery and restorative justice, was encapsulated in this deal. And that ultimately led to the establishment of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I think a question which many people ask, and there was a lot of that on social media when the late Archbishop died, around whether the price that we paid in South Africa is too high. The establishment, of course, of the Commission cemented the notion of a restorative justice approach where the focus is on victims and communities they come from rather than solely on perpetrators, and where reparations acknowledges the harm done and retribution does not play a central role. And if we're very frank, those of us who work in this field, South Africa played a key role in the design of the Rome Statute and signing that on. But when you look at the question of retributive justice across the world, you have to admit that it can be fairly selective. And so what you need are complementary processes which really deal with the past. And of course, according to the Archbishop, the emphasis on reconciliation rather than retribution is more consistent with indigenous African conceptions of justice. And he made the point that retributive justice is largely Western, and African understanding is more restorative, not so much as to punish, but to redress or to restore a balance that has been knocked anew. The Truth Commission, of course, had 3 committees: an amnesty committee that was made up of judges, the Human Rights Violations Committee, which was really the engine room of the commission and provided for the documentation of the violations, and also provided a forum for victims to testify to their suffering. And of course, together with the Reparations Committee, these committees facilitated the restoration of human dignity and really this question of recognition of people who had been excluded as South African citizens. The South African Truth Commission was, of course, the first one that held public hearings, the first one whose goals were linked to building national unity and reconciliation, and the first one which was premised on the belief that perpetrators also needed to be humanized, and that if they came forward and told the truth, that the families of victims would be able to begin closure on the violations they had suffered. It was also a recognition that the evidence about the crimes were in the hands of the perpetrators, and so the Commission provided a middle way to learn about the past and ensure that South Africa could move on. And the pivotal issue is building new relationships between those who had been victims and those who had been perpetrators. And of course, despite the imperfections in the process, and there were many, the Commission did achieve a number of successes, uncovered hidden aspects of the country's past, including the widespread and systematic policy by the state of torture, murder, rape, killings, and enforced disappearances. It identified institutional weaknesses in state bodies, including in the country's police and armed forces, and it developed a holistic and comprehensive policy on reparations and rehabilitation, as well as institutional reform. And much of the Commission's work became that of a flag bearer, establishing important innovative norms and standards, which are now considered the standard at an international level. But of course, despite these successes, there were weaknesses. Part of it, of course, was the notion that the Truth Commission would develop a reparations policy and that government would implement it. Bear in mind that reparations are measures taken by states to redress gross and systematic violations of human rights law or humanitarian law. And of course, in South Africa, Azapo and many prominent families not only took the amnesty law to court, but they also challenged the notion of the removal of their rights to civil compensation as a complete violation of their rights. And the Constitutional Court in the Azapo case confirmed not only the validity of the amnesty deal, but also accepted Judge Didcot's view that reparations would be an appropriate way of dealing with harm, as the country would be crippled by paying out civil claims. The democratic government also argued that every black South African is a victim who would benefit from government programs of development. But unfortunately, when the RDP program was scrapped and the first 10 years were over, we actually see that that didn't happen. The democratic state also delayed the delivery of reparations to victims and didn't honor the Commission's recommendations around both prosecutions and institutional reform. And this really is in violation of a key premise of the Act, that if you did not apply for amnesty or you were refused amnesty, then the law would follow its course. The second issue, of course, that I want to touch on is the distinction between what we call truth recovery and full disclosure. Because the Amnesty Committee was interested in full disclosure about the crimes or the violations you'd been implicated in. And you also had to satisfy the requirement that this had been done in pursuit of the political objects of the state or the liberation movements. But there's a big difference between telling the truth about everything you've been involved in and, of course, the question of a full disclosure. And a case that illustrates that is the case of a young student who was part of MK, who was studying in Swaziland, Nokuthula Simelane. She was lured back into South Africa by the security branch and Askaris. She was abducted in the Carlton Centre's garage, and she was detained, tortured, and then forcibly disappeared. In 2001, the TRC's Amnesty Committee, and in my view, made a huge mistake, granted some of the perpetrators amnesty for her abduction, but none of the perpetrators applied for amnesty for her murder. And of course, there was a complete difference between the evidence of the Askaris and the evidence of the security branch. The Askaris alleged that she had been shackled both on her arms and her legs, and she was so brutally tortured that she was unable to move. And they said that she had been seen in the custody of the security branch operatives, and it is highly unlikely that she would have been able to escape. The Amnesty Committee, of course, failed to make a link with the international crime of an enforced disappearance, and the perpetrators were not put on terms by the Amnesty Committee to disclose her final whereabouts and confirm that they were responsible for her murder. And these are legal obligations related to an enforced disappearance. But following an application by the family in 2016, the Soweto Death Squad was indicted for her murder. And what we have been arguing is that, in fact, they should also be indicted for the crime of an enforced disappearance. The trial will begin in May this year, but the NPA also refused the family's application to grant a nolli prosecute, because we have believed that if they don't want to pursue the international crimes, then we will do so on behalf of the family. The second issue I want to raise is the Truth Commission's narrow interpretation of its mandate. While it's true that the mandate focused primarily on civil and political violations, and this is a legacy of the Latin American approach, the Commission itself construed its mandate too narrowly, and in my view, obscured the structural and pervasive legacy of systemic violations, failing to recognize that the South African conflict was intrinsically about the systemic crimes of apartheid as set out under the Apartheid Convention. And there's no doubt that the laws and structural policies underpinning apartheid in South Africa went far beyond civil and political rights violations. And so the failure to examine the effect and impact of that allowed the beneficiaries really to escape responsibility, but it also obscured the link between racial power and racialized privilege. And I think that all of us would agree that to some extent this is the legacy with which we live today. Now, this is, of course, reflected in which the way the TRC's law was constructed. The crimes were defined in terms of domestic language, torture, abduction, and killings, rather than crimes under international law. And this was a debate we had in the Truth Commission. How do we look at these crimes of land dispossession, remembering that by 1913, 97% of the land had been taken? Question of homelands, land reservation, job reservation, exclusion from the economy and education. My colleague who is late now, Neville Alexander, was writing to us on a daily basis saying that if you want to sort out education in our country, you need to deal with the education issue. And of course, even though some of us argued this in the Commission, we were a microcosm of South Africa. And so those of us who argued for that lost the debate. And we were then given what was called thematic hearings, where we focused on the economy, the role of different professions, which were really important. But really the hearings we should have had should have been on land, the economy, and the exclusion from the economy, and the education policies, which really were about educating young black people to be the hewers of wood and the carriers of water, rather than people claiming their full rights as citizens. So it's not surprising that Mahmoud Mamdani, the Ugandan scholar, criticized the Commission for reducing what had happened in South Africa into a narrow truth, which failed to take account of what he called unjust economic policies, educational policies, and the racial dispossession of land. Mamdani criticized the TRC's limited approach to dealing with political violence and political justice, and its failure to address the socio-economic justice between victim and perpetrator. He also argued that this narrow focus on victims and perpetrator relationships as binary actually ignored the structural and administrative features of settler colonial apartheid and its racialized and ethicized socioeconomic stratifications. And he said that by extension, this would create a moral equivalency between the violence of the apartheid regime and the response of the resistance and violence associated with the liberation movements. And so it's not a surprise that on the eve of the handing over of the Truth Commission's first set of 5 volumes, the ANC actually took us to court. And there were many who argued that we treated the struggle with the same equivalence as that of the apartheid regime. And even though we argued that we acknowledged that they had fought a just war, but in the context of that war, the means that they had used had been in violation of the Geneva Conventions, they still argued we criminalized the struggle. To come to grips with the legacy of apartheid, Mamdani argued, it was necessary to understand how our identities had been institutionalized and reproduced as instruments of governance and subjection under apartheid. And he said that too much of our work was focused on the metaphor of the Holocaust that had given rise to the Nuremberg trials, where, according to him, the victims sat in judgment of individual perpetrators from the vanquished and ignored their own violations. And of course, people talk about the bombing of Dresden and many other incidents like that for which nobody was held accountable. Another consequence, of course, of this disconnect was the failure to deal with systemic questions like forced removals. And of course, by 1985, Lauren Patsky and Cheryl Walker reported that more than 3.5 million people were forcibly displaced in South Africa between 1960 and the mid-1980s alone, in one of the biggest state-organized projects of forced mass racial ethnic displacement in modern times. And if you go to the Rome Statute, this would be described as the crime of ethnic cleansing. Today, of course, forced removals continue to shape post-apartheid's human, social, and economic geography. Haunting us are the spatial arrangements of post-apartheid cities and intensifying what I would call forms of inequality and structural poverty. So I would argue that, of course, what South Africa did and the critique of it forced many other commissions in the world to begin to think about what we call the structural causes of violence. And today there is no longer a question about commissions having to interrogate this issue. But at the time in South Africa, people used to talk about first-generation rights and socioeconomic rights, even though it was in our constitution, were seen as second-generation rights. And at the international level, most countries were really terrified of dealing with this issue for fear that the reparations debate would come to haunt them as well. Then prevent that, and it's certainly out there. But let me come to this question of what I call the unfinished business. And as we deal with the squandering of the opportunities in our country for land restitution, the prosecution of those who did not apply for amnesty, the failure to implement reparations properly, or ensure that Black South Africans are enabled to access the economy, the feeling of betrayal and anger runs deep and is compounded by the failure to accept responsibility for the crimes and also the betrayal by us, the beneficiaries of the transition, because we need to acknowledge that we benefited from the transition and we've also failed to deliver on transformative justice to our people. In the last 23 years, we've also seen the denuding of institutions, including that of the National Prosecutorial Authority, the Hawks and Intelligence, to name a few. And this is compounded by a notion of a secret deal ostensibly concocted to give apartheid perpetrators another bite at the amnesty cherry, and also the venality of public and private officials who have been utterly corrupt, bringing South Africa to its knees. The unfinished business involves a process which has spanned more than 23 years, and where we have brought application after application to compel the NPA to public prosecution guidelines, to stop the president from using his discretion in respect of presidential pardons, to provide perpetrators of political crimes with another opportunity for amnesty. It's also germane to recall that the special unit established in the NPA to pursue these crimes did not prioritize or vigorously pursue its mandate, and alarmingly, the few efforts that have been made to secure successful prosecutions from the side of the state have only come about because the families of victims have gone to court and sustained the pressure on the state and the NPA. And so examples of that, the inquest into the death of Ahmed Timur. But unfortunately, despite the Supreme Court of Appeals ruling that Jean Rodrigues, the sole surviving perpetrator, his indictment would stand, Jean Rodrigues died last year. And so the Timur family, after their relentless struggle, are extremely bitter about the lack of justice. And interestingly, in a new development, Freedom Under Law, which represents the apartheid generals, have petitioned the Constitutional Court to be substituted in Jean Rodrigues' place, and have also started to argue for a permanent stay of prosecutions. We also opened inquest into the death of Neil Agate, the trade unionist, Hussein Haffiji, Ernest Dipali, and on our files we have at least another 20 cases which deal with deaths in detention. And just now I saw a report that one of the judges who was quite instrumental in these cases, I think passed away today. And so what you're seeing actually are both victims and perpetrators dying, and we're in this race against time. And I think that that really creates this intense pressure for the state and the NPA to do its work. But let me come to this question of the political economy. And in fact, I think the seeds of not dealing with these issues, we have to lay at the doors of the Truth Commission. Had they pursued these questions of the structural violations, I think perhaps South Africans would have appreciated more the divisions that really lie between all of us. The South African Reconciliation Barometer has consistently identified this notion of inequality, the gap between the rich and the poor. And a 2018 World Bank report also noted that that has increased. But I think the shocking figures are really that 20% of our country controls 70% of the country's assets and resources, and the wealthiest 10% own more than half of the national income. And we know now that the inequality gap has widened as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the UN Human Rights Development Report notes that 1 in 5 South Africans lives on less than $1.9 a day. And this is expected to worsen. The challenge, of course, for us is that it's deeply racialized, but it's also been exacerbated by a kleptocracy of political elites holding positions of power, both in the public and private sector. The level of venality ushered in under the rule of former President Zuma are extraordinary. Billions lost to state, trillions actually, lost to state capture, the destruction of key parastatals and institutions, and the decimation of institutions. And I think last year, when those 11 days happened in KwaZulu-Natal and Johannesburg, what we saw was the depths of this illustrated. Yes, it was probably organized, as we know now, from the report of intelligence. But at the same time, the young boy who took a pair of underpants, it was so poignant watching that, because so many people who looted only took what they needed to deal with their immediate needs. And what it revealed actually is the levels of deprivation in our country. But Cheryl Carolus, an ANC stalwart, pointed out recently that we had reached new lows, with government officials in collusion with the private sector stealing PPE funds. Effectively, who are you robbing? You're robbing the most poor. And while we know that the racialized poverty and inequality in our country have their roots in our colonial and apartheid past, to be very frank, it is no longer useful to apportion blame or responsibility, but rather we have to focus on solidarity and solutions. While not an excuse for our dire economic situation, South Africa, of course, mirrors most global economies in the world, which have failed to provide the conditions under which citizens can thrive. A World Economic Forum study on social mobility in 2020 pointed out that an individual's opportunities in life remain tethered to their socio-economic status at birth, entrenching historical inequalities. And this presents a challenge, not just for the individual, but society and the economy. So it's a systemic issue. And those of us who are sitting in the room know that if your parents were poor, what did they struggle for? They struggled for you to access education. And what you automatically took for granted is that your children, in turn, would be educated. And that is the way in which we transcend classes, right? Another word for social mobility. As we know, human capital is the driving force of economic growth. And anything that undermines that talent and impedes the accumulation of capital significantly hampers growth. The Global Social Mobility Index considers what a country can holistically do to foster social mobility for all its citizens, and it's markedly different from other methodologies. It focuses on drivers instead of outcomes, such as policies, practices, and institutions. That's the conventional way. But what it says is it uses 10 pillars, which are 5 determinants of social mobility: access to health, access to education, technology, work opportunities, working conditions, fair wages, and finally, social protection and inclusive institutions. If you go back to our Constitution, that's what was envisaged there. If you look at the institutions that were set up, the Reconstruction and Development Program, the setting up of a Human Rights Commission, the setting up of a Land Commission, all of these were meant to be institutions that would begin to address these problems. Not surprisingly, Denmark figures as the country with the best conditions for social mobility and is, at the top of the rank. We sit almost right at the bottom at number 77. The study also took into account that in most countries, it would take 2 generations to move from one class to another. But guess what? In our country, in Brazil, between 9 and 13 generations, unless there are massive interventions. An important pillar that I picked out of the study was what I call the access to technology. While the rest of the world is talking about artificial intelligence and the next technological leap, our citizens haven't even had access to Wi-Fi. And what we've seen with the COVID pandemic is that enhancing access to education is crucial to foster social mobility. And the ability to access these opportunities can often be unequal and perpetuate historical inequalities. And the study shows that access to technology has the potential to act as a further equalizer, and it has a potential to ignore distinctions of race and class, provided that it's provided, and it provides an unrestricted access to knowledge. Yes, there's fake news as well, but at the same time, we have seen how schools in the private sector were able seamlessly to move to an online platform. Whereas when you look at the public schools, I think you have to ask really hard questions about how many more generations are affected by the damage. New technology, of course, also has the potential to drive business growth, to create jobs, and to augment existing jobs, provided it can leverage the talents of a motivated and agile workforce. So this, I think, is a big challenge. But I was so excited to read last week about a technology project in Alexandra. It's called Go, 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 Go. And it's about a group of older persons in the township who are learning to be more tech savvy. And one of the women, a pensioner, said she had learned how to communicate with teachers during COVID lockdown through an app used by her granddaughter's school. And she says, before starting the lessons, I didn't know how the app worked, and I would miss important notices from the school. Now I can log in, I can check the notices. The one thing that, of course, made me laugh was when the screen goes black, when you haven't used it for some time, all of the Gogos were upset and kept thinking, what did they do wrong? And so they had to be shown how to restore those screens. Yesterday, Toby Shapshank, an IT expert, wrote an article in the Daily Maverick, and he titled it, South Africa's Judiciary Needs an Upgrade to the 21st Century Immediately. And he weighed in on the debates and he said, the person who is the best candidate for the job, in his opinion, is Dunstan Malambo. Why? Because he said Dunstan is credited with introducing technology to improving the running of the courts. And because he used the word modernization, Dunstan would get his vote. And he said, forget about the desperately needed state capture cases and think about the real necessity of an updated judicial system. The mothers embroiled in time-consuming, mentally draining, and utterly outdated court processes for simply getting child maintenance orders. I'm not sure how many of you lawyers have spent time in the maintenance court. When I was a young attorney, I would have to appear in Mr. Smith's court, Magistrate Smith's court in Johannesburg, and I would dread it if I was acting for a man, because he automatically assumed that your client was in the wrong and you knew you would be subject to intense pressure. That place has just got worse. And when you look at the queues there, and you look at the sort of desperation of women just trying to get the necessary funds to take care of their children, you understand what Toby means. And so imagine if we could create jobs for young people through digital technology, and if we could assist all the Gogos in the informal market. In Ghana and in Kenya, people are trading using pesos. So you don't need to have a bank account. You can have a mobile phone, and you can begin to do all of that. There's no doubt, of course, that the social and economic consequences of racialized inequality and poverty are profound and far-reaching. There's a growing sense of anger, a sense of unfairness, and there's a precariousness about our situation. There's a perceived loss of identity and dignity, the weakening of the social fabric, and eroding trust in institutions, disenchantment with political processes, and we all feel that there's been an erosion of the social contract. Karl Marx, of course, and I always turn to him, he said that human beings are physical beings whose needs and aspirations and goals can be fulfilled mainly by material rather than ideal objects. And he said that there's still a raging debate which continues today on idealism versus materialism. I think we all have to look at ourselves very, very closely, because we need to restore hope to our country. We need to transform our country. We need to address the racialized poverty and inequality. And we have to do it together from a point of solidarity and avoid navel gazing and the apportionment of blame. All of us need to make a concerted effort to create new pathways for social justice, ensuring that everyone has a fair and just opportunity for success. Because we have to recognize that so many years down the line, this part of our transition is still incomplete. I want to tell you a story that I was told by Professor Injabulo when the commission had just completed its work. It's the story of the lion and the rabbit, and of course you might have heard it. The rabbit is trapped in a cave. The lion, in fact, captured the rabbit as prey, and he took him to the cave to keep him there while he was going to do other things. And the rabbit tells him that the roof of the cave is about to collapse, and the lion is stronger than the rabbit is. And so therefore, the lion should actually hold up the roof of the cave while the rabbit goes out to look for help. Needless to say, the rabbit doesn't come back. And Professor Injabulo says, well, one can think about the story in many different ways. He says, initially I used to think that us black people were the ones holding up the cave, and the rabbit was the clever one who got away. But he says, you have to think about it differently, that what it actually needs are both the talents of the rabbit and the lion if we are to change the conditions in our country. I mean, it's a much longer story and much more intricate because he goes through many different scenarios. But I think the point he makes is that we have a shared identity. This is our country. We can't run anywhere. And we keep thinking that if we build higher walls, put in more electric fences, we will ensure our safety and security. The real safety and security comes from investing in our people, so that those words that we have in the preamble to the Constitution actually make sense. And that is something that we can live by with all of the difficulties that we've gone through. But what we need is hope and inspiration. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yasmin, for that inspiring and incredibly informative talk. We're going to go cross over to our Q&A section. So for you guys in the audience, if you have any questions, if you could raise your hands. I already have something online, a couple of questions. This first one is from Stephen Mukwena. And Stephen says, land is an indispensable resource in agricultural production. However, majority of land is still in the hands of the minority. Do you agree that Section 25 of the Constitution should be amended to transfer the land in the hands of the state for fair and equitable land distribution?
Thank you. I think that's a really interesting question. And I know that Section 25, of course, was the product, it was one of the compromises in the Constitution. I also know that the state has gone through quite an extensive process in seeking really the views of South Africans. And in fact, if you read the report that was prepared by the former president, Kgalema Motlanthe, where he really goes out in our country to interview people who are sitting both on tribal land, people who have no title deeds, no real rights in land. I think what is clearly necessary is that there's a need for reform. The question, though, I think, and you've seen that the ruling party lost that vote in Parliament, it doesn't change the situation. And I recall that, like, for instance, in tribal authority land, women have no rights. They're not even allowed to go before a chief who demands that a male relative comes before them. The state, of course, is also the holder of much land, and I think we've never really properly had a process which seeks to really get a sense of how much of that was there. So I think it's a, you know, and before I came in here, I bumped into a colleague whom I used to work with, who's been dealing with these questions, and I said, can you tell me if anywhere in the world there's a successful land restitution project? And she said, well, the land project in South Africa in terms of policies and laws have been really interesting. But if we talk about restitution, That just doesn't happen. And I think that should be part of the national conversation, because the difference between South Africa and many other countries in the world is 97% of the land transferred by 1913. So that's huge, much huger than other parts of Africa where colonial dispossession accounts for a lot of that. But we also have to avoid political elites from grabbing it, which I think is also a problem. We have a lot of people who own farms, and I think that's something we should look at. How many government officials, how many ministers actually own land that they shouldn't have? But yeah.
How much of it is getting to the people, actually?
Yeah.
Okay, very good point. Thank you.
Yeah.
Stephen, I hope that answered your question. Are there any questions from the floor? Yes, one question over there.
Thank you very much.
I think, is it on? Is it on? Oh, it is on, sorry.
Thank you very much. It was just a privilege to be in such wisdom this evening. I know tonight's conversation was a lot about South Africa, but I'm curious to know, because you talked about the standards that our own, sort of global standards that our own commission has set in the last 20 years, and how, from your experience, other potential countries or countries has done better in terms of their own their own commissions and their own methodologies that they have used in instance South Sudan and Sri Lanka, where you've worked and been part of those processes, or other parts where we've seen learnings from, the weaknesses in our own.
Thank you. I mean, when I left South Africa in 2000 and I think 3 or 4 to go to Sierra Leone, I had come out of a number of meetings with the captains of industry around this question of restitution and reparations. And I have to say they were very interesting, because a lot of them were willing at that point, they had their checkbooks ready, to put money into the President's Fund. But interestingly, the government let them off the hook, thinking that they would then go back to them for investment in other areas of government. That didn't happen. And I think that's when the disenchantment set in. So I went to Sierra Leone as a very angry person, thinking that we in the Commission had just not done enough. And not done enough on a whole range of fronts, the socioeconomic dimension, really tying up reparations and all of the institutional reform issues. And in the South African instance, and I didn't deal with it tonight, do you know that the word gender, or advancing the rights of women, was absent from the law? And so when the Commission began its work, it was approached by a number of women's groups, Women's Legal Center, the Center for the Applied Legal Studies, and of course some of the women in the ANC saying, so what is the Commission going to do about this issue? And it forced us actually to take a step back and to really begin to think about how we would incorporate that in the work of the Commission. And this is surprising given the fact that during the negotiations, which was sort of happening at the same kind of time when the law was being, in that post-period, the law was being drafted, it was women from the ANC who reached across to women of the other, both the former government, to other liberation movements, to set up the Women's National Coalition. And in fact, they drafted a charter demanding that each negotiating group would have a third of its membership made up of women, that we would have an equality clause, that all of the parties should reserve, a third of the seats for women, including a domestic violence clause. So it was one of the lessons which the Sierra Leoneans took up, the need to really look at the question of how conflict affects both men and women, boys and girls in different ways, but also how to think about the work of a Truth Commission to really advance the rights of women in a society. I think the second was this issue of public hearings. Before South Africa, all of the commissions had done their work in a very administrative way. So the South African Commission actually is the first one that begins to hold public hearings and to deal with victims directly. And that really correlates with this notion of recognition and acknowledgement, And if you go back to this question of restorative justice, you know, most of the famous peace scholars will tell you that you have many different processes. The first process is this process of dialogue. The second is an acknowledgement of the violations and the pain and the suffering that is caused. And from that, you move to another phase. And so reparations, which is also made up of both moral and material reparations, is both about acknowledgement, but also the recognition of victims having the rights of citizens, so that the state works for them, irrespective of which group they belong to, or which race, or ethnic, you know, or tribal identity. So this was, you know, these are part of the norms that have been established. And I think there isn't, you know, the one big difference, of course, was that up until Nuremberg and the Latin American experiences, truth commissions were seen as substitutes when you couldn't get a criminal justice process. I think with this work of the South African Commission, truth commissions began to be seen as an important component of the healing process, which sits alongside and is complementary to the criminal justice process, reparations, and institutional reform. And in fact, what it forced the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to do is really to begin redeveloping what they call the principles to combat impunity. And in fact, if you go back to the Secretary General, in 2004, following the work of the Commission, he begins to issue a statement which have now become sort of principles that are used in different countries. I came back from South Sudan on Sunday, actually, and of course, in the South Sudan case, part of the peace agreement has a chapter that is called Chapter 5. And Chapter 5 is about, you know, this followed the Obasanjo inquiry into violence in 2013 in South Sudan. And Obasanjo actually recommended to the African Union that they set up these different structures. So a hybrid court, which would try those who bear the greatest responsibility for serious crimes, a commission on truth, healing, and reconciliation, and a compensation and reparations authority. And the African Union is mandated to set up the hybrid court. But lo and behold, that was in 2015. We're now in 2022. The government has chosen to begin the process of setting up a truth commission, but are very clear that they're loath to do that because at the end of the day, it would implicate all of them. Now, of course, the commission has a list of perpetrators that we keep adding to. We call it people of interest. It's a confidential list, and it links individuals who have a command or superior role in events or incidents and crimes. And one day, we will hand that over to either the prosecutor of a court or the Office of a High Commission for Human Rights to kind of hold and store. Now, this is interesting, you know, what we've also seen in the world goes through cycles. So 1960s, strong prosecutorial ethic, you have the ad hoc tribunals for Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia, you have the special court for Sierra Leone. But you have great excitement when the ICC is finally set up. But the results have been disappointing. And in fact, the threat by African member states to withdraw from that after Umar al-Bashir was indicted has certainly forced the court to actually begin to look at its own policies and practices. So I would say that what you've seen is a retreat at an international level for setting up criminal accountability structures like courts. So what you have is now what we call new generation mechanisms. So the IIIM for Myanmar, which was set up by the Human Rights Council, the IIIM for Syria, the Commission on South Sudan, we have what we call new generation mandates, and that is you don't just investigate matters from a human rights perspective, but you also cross over into criminal investigations, and you collect and you preserve evidence for the possibility that in the future you will be able to prosecute. And one example of that you've seen, you know, this guy Razlan, who was one of the commanders in the war in Syria, he was prosecuted and convicted by a German court, and that is using some of the evidence that came from the Syria mechanism. So world goes through stages. The best place to deal with this is domestically.
Thank you very much. I have a couple of questions from our members on the Zoom meeting. Cholofelo says, so I am correct to say that the TRC failed to heal the wounds of the past and get the people who face these harsh treatments healed, also failed at reconciliation and getting perpetrators accountable.
I think, it's very, I never expected that the Truth Commission would heal the wounds of the past. I think the Truth Commission was one instrument amongst many. And if you go back to the interim constitution and the 34 agreed principles and the commitment to set up institutions which would be part of the transformation of South Africa, you begin to see that if they all operate together, then of course you can change things. The Archbishop was also very quick to say reconciliation is a process. It's not a parcel or a gift that you tie up and you hand over. And I think that's the mistake. And I think it was Professor Nicola who talked about the deep trauma in our society. I don't think South Africans have really begun to grapple with this trauma that we all live with on a daily basis. And there's a real need for many different programs which begin to address the damage that has been done to our psyches. And in fact, perhaps it will be the next generation that emerge without being affected by that. But there's no doubt in my mind that Commission, the famous song by Pink Floyd, that's what Sierra Leone brought home to me, that you put a brick in the wall, but it's naive and maybe obscene to believe that you can deliver so much. You have to do your job. And if you do it well, you have a brick in the wall, and somebody else can come and build on it. And that's the humility that we have to have in the way in which we deal with all these functions, because otherwise we get carried away and we don't build the kind of society that is necessary to carry on these initiatives once the train has gone out of the station, or the spaceship that came and went. And I think that's what South Africans need to think about, sustainability of initiatives.
It's an ongoing process, and I guess the trap we fall into is thinking of it as a cure-all, whereas it is really much a process. Sibusiso says, what more should have been done to make the TRC more effective and to bring about true healing to the victims?
I think the Commission tried very hard to be what it called victim-centered. And in fact, the way in which it dealt with victims is actually what has become quite a norm for bodies like Truth Commissions. And I have to say that, the hard choice that we in civil society were faced with when the discussions on the amnesties began was, do we participate, don't we participate? But then we went in and we said, well, how do we protect the rights of victims? We know that the interim constitution talks about reparations for victims, but what does that actually mean in the context of an amnesty process which takes away their rights? And we said, well, if you give them the right to oppose the process, if you appoint lawyers for them, if you allow a separate stream of hearings where they can come and speak about their own, give testimony about what has happened to them, and if you ensure that the reparations program is done in a way which takes account of their views, then you will have made a difference. And in fact, this is quite extraordinary, and my colleague who is late now, Professor Mkhize, brought together probably South Africa's best experts at the time. So economic experts, social experts, psychologists, and someone I think like Iraj Abedian was part of that team. Don Foster was part of that team. And in fact, they looked at these questions of, is money enough? And we decided that you would have a package of 25,000 Rand per year for 5 years so that people didn't squander it all at once, but that in a way it provided some kind of bedrock for maybe a pension or pulled together, it could do something We also talked about community reparations, because that would be another way you would deal with communities that were affected. So I think we also said that there should be a program in which people would be able to receive access to trauma counseling, bearing in mind that even when the Commission was doing its work, when you looked at where the trauma specialists were, they would be in urban areas and not in rural areas. And there just weren't enough to go around. And so you had to think about training people who normally do that, teachers, nurses, principals, religious leaders, to kind of begin to take on that process. But in my view, our country has never taken this issue seriously. And I remember originally, even in the Commission, people would say, you know, that's a Western notion, the notion that you need to go to a psychologist or a counselor. I think today everybody recognizes that we're in a nation in deep distress. And so we need to think about how we can provide support for those services. So yes, healing is a long-term process, and I don't think we've really begun to address that. And you know what worries me now? When you look at the families who are taking up these cases, this is the next generation. So Lukanya Kalata, who was a baby when his father was murdered, is the one driving the process for justice and accountability. Tembi Nkadiming, she was 6 years old when her sister was kidnapped. And so what we're reproducing is trauma in the next generation and families. And I think that's something we have to think about. How do we actually deal with it?
Are there any more questions from the room? I've got loads more online, and we are running out of time, so I'm going to try.
On? Okay.
Yes, it's on. Go for it.
First of all, I just want to say thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. Also from someone that doesn't study law, but isn't exposed to this much as well. So my question might not make much sense, but I just wanted to ask, so obviously with South Africa dealing with the trauma of apartheid, and it was a genocide, and from how I understood what you said, retributive justice and transformative justice, so it's like in certain universities and stuff, like also the trauma of having the like old colonial leaders still be in the universities and stuff, was that not seen as a form of like trauma that other students are also experiencing? And then it took students protesting for it to actually be seen as an issue that, okay, like seeing this like old apartheid person might actually trigger more trauma for people that experience that. Like we don't know whose family members were maybe murdered by that. So what I kind of want to ask is like, why is it from the law side, or I don't know if it is included in the law side, why those kind of laws wouldn't be put up to kind of remove those? I know they can be seen as like historical figures, but it's historical figures with like bad connotations to them, and they cause trauma for people and people feel uncomfortable. So from like the law side, why is it that it wasn't something that was like, people didn't make a big deal to try and remove them? It was just kind of kept there, and then it took students to literally protest, and then the students then, I guess it is like when you are vandalizing, but it's also like, why were those kept when laws could be put in place to kind of remove that sector of like trauma for students? Yeah, thank you.
It's a very tricky question, and in fact, I was part of the I can't even remember what it was called at UCT. You know, following the roads must fall protest and the fees must fall, and UCT was brave enough to set up this panel, and what we were looking at were what were the reasons for the protest, but also to deal with much of the violations. In fact, some of them students were prosecuted for. And I think what really emerged was huge trauma at so many different levels. But what I found interesting was that other university vice chancellors were phoning us to say, can they replicate some of these processes? But then I said, well, you can do that, but bear in mind, once you start it, you have no control. And it was amazing how many of them sort of then backed down. And, you know, for instance, he was a student and he was asked, why did he pull the painting down and burn it? And he said that in the heat of the moment, his anger was such that he just saw the color of the faces and say, pull these valuable paintings down, and he threw it into a fire. And I think what it showed is that perhaps we have taken for granted, all of us, that while we remove the vestiges of, you know, racial laws and discrimination from the statute books, we haven't looked at the decolonization issue properly. And we haven't, I don't think we've begun to deal with that. And I know we use this word, decolonization, but what does it actually mean? And what does it mean from a student's perspective? And I think there's a lot of that. And you will recall that meeting that we kind of had to do with students when it all just started. And it's a tricky issue, and it needs a lot more work. I don't have an answer. But having sat through that process for almost 18 months, it was very difficult.
Thank you. We are running out of time, and there are lots of questions online. There are questions in the room. We're going to take 2 more questions in the room. For our viewers online, we have a record of all your questions, and we will do our best to send them on to Yasmin, and if she has the time, she can respond to you. We really thank you for your interaction. In the meantime, there's a question over here.
Evening, guys, and thank you for the platform. It's very brave of you to acknowledge that you, in plain words, you guys messed up with the TRC. Yeah, I realize.
I'm not saying we messed up. I said there were challenges and weaknesses.
It's very brave, and what I do realize is you guys never expected the trauma side of what is the effect going to be on the ground and in social dimensions. And you mentioned something that made me even more passionate of driving this thing of social justice, is because you said it will take 13 generations. I'm sorry, it's not going to take 13 generations. And you said we need solidarity and we need solutions. And the thing I think we don't focus on is transgenerational relationships. It's where, you know what I think most of you guys know what transgenerational relationships is. And where you take the people that can see what the challenges was and how they failed, and us that's dealing with the trauma can help each other to get the dialogue going. So I think one of the solutions that we should look at, and should be a national conversation, is how do we deal with this transgenerational relationships when it comes on the social mobility of our country. When you get a young guy in a space where he's surrounded by many people that's older than him, I'm talking you on the ground, I'm talking literally on the ground, they don't take you seriously. They don't see what you see. And you deal with the decision makers that's sitting on the other side of the desk. They are employed just to follow the mandate. So on the ground, we can see what should be implemented. Like, I sympathize with you with the statute thing. You see how deep it goes. And we want to remove that type of mentality of young people to break down, rather to face and get the conversation going, to reconcile and find the solutions to the transgenerational relationships that can move us forward. I think it's not going to take 13 generations if we have more discussions like the social justice discussions. But we should broaden it in how? Technology. You highlighted the role of technology. We should get more people on the ground pushing this. I think COVID really put a hold on many of the projects that we want to derive. But transgenerational relationships is going to be very vital in this process. Thank you.
I can only agree with you. I mean, I think that, you know, it's this question of being able to hear each other. And I think it was somebody like Professor Albie Sachs, who himself was a victim of a bombing and who appeared before the Truth Commission. And he talked about 4 different kinds of truth. He talked about the forensic truth that you get ostensibly from the courts, although during the apartheid years I would doubt that. But he also talked about social truths and dialogical truth. And that is this question of engagement. But more than that, it's about how do we hear each other? Because listening is one thing, but how do you hear? And, you know, when we dealt with the Institutional Justice Commission at UCT, it was about these questions. The university didn't really know how deeply offended is even the right word to use, students were by it. And of course, in that moment of rage, they only saw it as an opportunity to tear down. And I think the question is, how are we actually channeling anger? How do we manage conflicts? And not just conflicts at student level, but conflicts between people on a daily basis in our society. And I think you're right. And a question that I've always asked is leadership out of touch with the realities of what young people need and want? And the 13 generations issue is if you have no interventions, and that is why the focus has to be on what those interventions will be. And what's interesting about the study is it doesn't go the usual conventional way about how do you improve your life and your conventional story about the economy, etc. It looks at the factors which deal with the quality of people's life. So do you have access to healthcare? What is that access to education? Do you trust the institutions that are there? And then this question of technology, which, to be frank, I mean, an example I always use, in visiting refugee camps, I've been struck by the fact that every tent that I've seen had either a little round solar panel or a tiny square one, enough to power up cell phones, laptops, provide one light, and a stove. Now, if you consider what we've gone through in our country, just around the electricity issue, what stops us from creating this green economy and really empowering young people to be able to take on these technical issues in our communities? South Africa enjoys abundant sun and wind, but why are we still dependent on moribund institutions? So to me, that's an example of where we need the interventions. They're not rocket science. But that's the one thing, if you travel through the region, you actually see the entrepreneurship and the way in which people are self-employed. They don't, maybe because their governments haven't really provided, they don't wait for that. Whereas, and I talked about the example, women selling cattle on a cell phone, using pesos and moving money by mobile phone. Just think about all the difficulties we have in our country with simple things. There's a real need for a technological revolution, but also to think outside of the box.
Thank you. I've got one last question. I think that was a really interesting question, and I think there's a lot to be said for, as you say, the process of working through this trauma and touch on transgenerational trauma. I think there's a tendency for the youth to be excluded from processing the traumas of the legacy of apartheid because you weren't there, but you are living that experience. And that's, that is just really shows me the levels at which this needs to happen, and discourse is, I suppose, a starting point for it. So thank you for bringing out that question and for taking ownership of this discourse. I think that's really important. One last question from the Prof.
I feel very guilty. Thank you, Yasmin, for so much clarity, empathy, and hope. After giving us that heavy analysis of what's happening, it was difficult to figure out what next. But you lifted us out of that and showed us that there's a way. Still back on trauma. Last year, somebody gave me a book by Helene Opperman Lewis. And up until she gave me that book, whenever I thought about generational trauma, I was always thinking of the trauma of the victims. For example, when people are thinking about generational trauma in South Africa, they're thinking about what happened to the Africans, Coloureds, and those classified as Indian, as in Indian or Asian. But she says, when you debase people, when you dehumanize people, you too become dehumanized. And in the process, she details just generally why the world is upside down. She traces Afrikaner, for example, debasement by the English, and then Afrikaner debasing the blacks, etc. Israeli. She talks about all of that. The question that I want to ask you is, do you agree with her that if we're talking about a nation that has been traumatized, it's everyone, it's not just the ones who were killed or denied land. That's number one. The second thing would be, what do you want us to do? What do you suggest we do? We've got this MUSA plan for social justice, and one of the things we've been looking for is, what do we do immediately? Because, as you said yourself, we can't wait for anybody to come and lift us out. And the longer it takes, the more difficult it's going to be. And that should apply to all of the things that we've spoken about, integrating people in the economy, because up until now, we only dealt with the political settlement. So how do we come up with a new settlement that deals with these other things? Specifically, who does what, when? And what would you do yourself? What role would you like to play in this process?
I mean, I remember coming to the commission with a very sort of prosecutorial kind of attitude, and then evolving, because like someone like the Arch, he always made the point that the dehumanization was not just of victims and victims' communities, but that the dehumanization affected perpetrators and their communities as well. And I think there were a number of questions around how far the mandate went back. And remember, the Commission was a microcosm of people who came from so many different stratas of society. And one thing, I had never understood the sort of history of conflict between Afrikaners and the English. And then, of course, I was told about how people had been interned at Koffiefontein and the dehumanization of people, and how, there were two people in the commission. The one was part of the aristocracy of Afrikaner, if one could call it that, and the other was a supper. And I never understood those distinctions until it was kind of explained to me, and you realize that that legacy of trauma affected Afrikaners. There was a real sense that one had to also grapple with this colonial period in South Africa, and there had been no reckoning, if one can put it that way. So I think the Archbishop was very clear that the process of the commission was about how do you make people human again? And part of that is listening. It doesn't mean a soft option. And I give you one incident. The amnesty process didn't work initially. There wasn't that much trust in the process. And then we had this one particular death squad, and two lawyers contacted us, two young Afrikaans lawyers, and they said, we want to have a meeting with you guys to discuss how you encourage them, and we need to know how this process works. And so the Arch and myself and another commissioner, we go to meet with the lawyers, and the lawyers said to us, they were shaken up by the stuff their clients had revealed, and as proof of the authenticity, they would give us a list of the incidents they'd been involved in. So anyway, we have a meeting with them. And what was quite striking about that meeting was how much they needed to unlift the burden of what had happened to them. And if there's one critique I have of the late president, former President de Klerk, it's that, when he appeared before the commission the second time, he said that my government has never authorized the setting up of death squads. My government is not responsible for the crimes of these. And he said he had this bad apple theory. And what that did, of course, was that it forced the generals to make a submission which would allow political cover for the foot soldiers. But what it did was even bigger. You see, many young Afrikaners had been waiting for the president to come and say, this is apartheid, it was wrong, it was criminal, and these are the consequences, and I wholeheartedly accept responsibility for it, and he didn't do that. And that created, I think, this huge sense of we weren't taken in, and we were shamed even by our own side, even though we were educated to take these issues up in a philosophical way. So I think that dehumanization, it makes it possible for you to destroy the other. And part of this is about rehumanizing us and allowing each of us to understand that we may come from different parts. We may have all, and you know that question of, do you have a binary thing of a victim and perpetrator? You don't. That's the other discovery, that people have multiple identities. And so we also need to think about that. So I think in terms of this intergenerational question, I think the work you're doing here is incredible. And it's really important to have the conversations. But it has to go beyond that. And maybe we've got to stop thinking about working only with government. I think government must be an enabling partner, but I don't think they should be taking the lead on this. I think that it's people, universities, South Africans should begin to have these conversations because it's about us and our children and our grandchildren. We want the world to be a better place for them, and that should be the focus. And we've got to think about what do we really need to do to harness the talents of people, because they're incredible when you look at what people are doing, but what they need are opportunities. And so that's where the solidarity has to come from. And we have to, we need a new social compact. And it can't be about politics. It has to be about solidarity and how we work together to transform our country, to ensure that there's a real transformative justice program in place.
Wow, okay. Thank you very much, Yasmin Suka, ladies and gentlemen. Incredibly powerful. Thank you so much.
Thank
we
you.
really, really appreciate it. Obviously, there's so much more we could go into. There are so many questions online, and we really thank you for the depth of your inquiry and the heart that you put into those questions. We will forward them on to you if you get the time to address them. That would be absolutely amazing. So we thank you online for being a part of this, and for all of you in the room. Thank you so much.
Thank
Yasmin
you.
Suka, thank you
Thank you.
so much. A round of
Thank you.
applause, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to close off briefly with a vote of thanks and closing remarks from the one and only, my daughter's best friend, Professor Thuli Madonsela.
Greetings, dear colleagues. All protocol observed. One of the quote moments extracted from a book titled Disorder in Courts centers on a question asked by an attorney to a witness concerning his date of birth. Okay, the questioning proceeded in the following manner. Attorney, what is your date of birth? Witness, July 18. Attorney, what year? Witness, every year. Rob, I'm not stealing your job. I just couldn't resist. But I took a risk because I wasn't sure if people would get the joke. But the key relevance of the joke really is the fact that today we're here to celebrate Social Justice Day. And we've done it with so much seriousness, so much information, so much clarity, and so much hope. And thank you, Yasmin, for that. To our Dean of Law, Nicholas Smith, who must be having many versions of herself, because if she's always there for our events, I always wonder, how does she split herself between all of the units that need her leadership? Again, there was clarity in her presentation, brief, but very clear about why we have a social justice chair, and that it's not just a random thing, it is rooted in the university's vision. And somebody has to correct me if I'm wrong, but I do think that it's the only university I know that has a restitution statement. And to Yasmin Suka, I liked you saying that the focus right now should be on what should we do as opposed to who did what. It doesn't mean we should forget. As we solve the problem, we'll have an idea of what happened. But your advice reminded me of an African saying that a leopard is chasing us, and you're busy asking me or arguing with me about whether it's a female or a male. And of course, none of us wants to be discussing the sex of a leopard when it's chasing us. We just want to run away as fast as you can. And you've given us a reason why we need to run as fast as we can on the question of dealing with social justice. We decided to commemorate it today, yet it's a day that has been declared by the UN as a global day. So its real birthday is the 20th of February, but that was going to fall on Sunday. It's heartening that the UN has decided that there should be a global focus on social justice, which will be happening on Sunday and on several days around this day. And this has been the case since 2009. In 2017, the UN issued a very clear instruction to the rest of the world to double up on initiatives to advance social justice and do everything we can to bring about a socially just world. I, for one, often wonder, why did it take the UN so long, 2009, to start telling us, let's work for social justice? It's a concept that has been around since 1843. A Catholic priest, a Jesuit priest, coined it in 1843, Luigi Taparelli. At that stage, the main concern was fairness in terms of the fruits of the economy between those who owned the means of production and those who worked. 1919, after the First World War, global leaders realized the link between conflict and injustice. And they adopted the Treaty of Versailles, which specifically refers to social justice, and which treaty eventually was the foundation for the ILO. And I suppose we all know that the ILO, one of its declarations is a declaration on social justice and fair globalization, which was adopted in 2008. Then there was nothing until 1993, the Copenhagen Declaration again try to mobilize us around social justice. It's difficult to understand why it didn't gain traction, but I've reflected on it, and as a team we've reflected on it, is that people tend to associate social justice with socialism, or in the past they tended to do that because a lot of Marxists, of course, were egalitarian. But it's a coincidence that Marxism, of course, is social justice at the core of it. But social justice, if you read the book by John Rawls, 1971, A Theory of Justice, it's just about justice. And people would say, well, when justice was conceived in Greece and other places, it didn't talk about group justice. It's not because there were no groups. It's because there was a time in this world when the humanity of some people that Yasmin spoke to us about was not recognized. In this country and various places, justice, I think Aristotle said justice is justice for equals. And who were the equals? It was men with property, women, slaves, and others were not counted. And therefore, that's why they didn't think about group justice then. But since Luigi Taparelli, 1843, we came to understand that we have to deal with group justice. And has it never amazed you the fact that if you compare the French Constitution after the French Revolution and the South African Constitution after the internal conflict and after the near war, you find that after the French adopted their constitution on equality, fraternity, which is solidarity, and equality, which is it's equality, fraternity, and solidarity. With the French, that has always influenced everything they've done every day. That's what we're trying to build. Almost like that man that when JF Kennedy visited NASA, as they were running up to send people to the moon, he met a man who you would regard as a janitor and asked him, "What are you doing here, sir?" And the janitor said, "I'm working to send the first man on the moon. I'm contributing to sending the first man to the moon." So how often do we as South Africans, or even our leaders, or any cleaner, or the 8-year-olds that were reading the preamble, just think about every little thing that I'm doing is contributing to healing the divisions of the past and establishing a society that is based on 3 goals or pillars: democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. So if we were doing those things, do you think we would have made more progress during and after the TRC if every decision was benchmarked against, will this lead to a more democratic society, a society that is based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights? I don't know. But here at the Social Justice Chair, law school here at Stellenbosch University and at the university, we think if we consciously think about social justice, we can deal with this unfinished business that Ms. Yasmin has spoken to us about. And she has indicated that that unfinished business includes land. But firstly, the Constitution promises that we're building a society that is based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. And that's a society where everyone's potential is freed and life improved. Silo Hatang, who's the CEO of the Nelson Mandela Foundation, says that's a promise. Do you agree with me that that's a promise? And lawyers will tell you that a promise is a debt that must be paid. So if you don't deliver on your promise, you are as good as somebody who hasn't paid their debt. So that means we haven't paid our debt to the people we've made promises in the Constitution. But who are those people? They are all of us. But we've got to disaggregate ourselves. So we all made this promise to ourselves, and Yasmin Suka has made it clear that there are those of us who have collected the low-lying fruits of democracy, those who were involved in the transition. And therefore, instead of using these spaces to eat first, which Simon Sinek says leaders should eat last, but is it possible that in the 27 years of democracy and 25 years of implementing the Constitution, it's been leaders eat first? For example, I'm intrigued. My colleague Yasmin, you said that, did quote and others said at the Constitutional Court that it would bankrupt South Africa if there was meaningful reparations to people like Balisa Musa, on whose name we're using in the M plan, arrested at the age of 12 on June 16, tortured, kept in solitary confinement, and her education arrested in the process. And when we met her in 2017, she was poor. From the TRC process, she got 30,000 rand. What are you going to do with 30,000 rand? But members of parliament that joined parliament for the first time in 1994 came up with a law to equalize pensions between them and those who were in parliament before 1994. That's Minister of Finance, Mrs. van Heerden. When this matter was taken to the Constitutional Court, the Constitutional Court did not say that this was going to bankrupt South Africa. Is it possible that what Minister or MEC Mayor says, we all find it easy to treat poor people poorly? And those words have stayed with me when I was Papa Protector and he was Minister of Health here in the Western Cape. And despite teamwork with his people, he just found that people found it easier to treat poor people poorly. And probably boils down to what you said, Yasmin, about how we dehumanize people. Ubuntu says, you can't throw away a person. And normally with thinking with Ubuntu, we always think about it is about the interconnectedness of humanity. I am because we're interconnected and therefore we'll support each other. But Bishop Tutu gives us the far more important part of Ubuntu, which is really, it is about the equal worth of everybody's life. And I'm just thinking that if we can start focusing on the constitutional goals, but as we think about BE, there was an Equality Act, there was Chapter 5 of the Equality Act, which was abandoned because, again, it was going to be difficult for industry. But BEE came in, which was even far more difficult, especially for small businesses. But it went through because the elite are benefiting from it. So I could go on. I've just come from a land conference, dear colleagues, so let me just end it. But I think what we've been warned, though, by Yasmin is we're in this boat and it's going through perilous waters. It doesn't matter whose mistake it was, But if we want it to reach the destination, the beautiful South Africa that is where there is democratic values, social justice and fundamental human rights, where everyone's life is improved and everyone's potential freed, then we all have to work for it. Because what does that working for it mean is we all have to invest in making it worthwhile for everyone to save South Africa. I'm just going to, in ending, quote from Helen Opperman-Lewis. During the land conference, we've spoken about the conflict in this country has always been about land. And she talks about when it started, there was friendship between the settler community and the locals. The locals gave the settler community land, but trouble started when there was expansion. And it was interesting, during the workshop today, somebody spoke about how farmers, it's natural that they always want to expand, but that's what created problems, because they had created a barrier between the farmers on the one side and the people. So it's always been about land. But in all of that trauma, in all of those difficulties, there was still one young magistrate. His name was Andries Stokkerstrom. Andries Stokkerstrom was appointed a magistrate in Graaf-Reinet at the age of 23 in 1815. This is what it said about him. From the start, he waged a lonely battle for peace and justice in the frontier. Young Andries, even at the age of 18, took a different view. Peace was possible, he said, if there is strict, equal justice at all costs. That's the only safe way. Can you imagine? 18, young person knew what young people know today, the ones that we teach most of them, is that really we have a beautiful country. To keep it beautiful, to keep our coexistence beautiful, we have to deal with the unfinished business of restorative justice and restitution. So I would like to thank you, Yasmin, for an amazing lecture. Thank you to Nicholas Smith, the Dean, for an amazing introduction. And of course, the one and only Rob van Vuren. You were amazing, sir. And I saw you doing your job at the Indaba Foundation, and I felt there are comedians and there are comedians, and you are my comedian. Thank you to everyone. And to all of you colleagues for coming here, and those who are joining us online, thank you for taking your time. It's not wasted, it's an investment in peaceful coexistence. Ubuntu says, if we want peace, if we want survival, if we want resilience for our community, we have to invest in each other's welfare. And this is what it's all about. Thank you. Blessings.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us tonight, for being involved in this discussion, for taking the discourse forward, for all of you online for joining us. Thank you once again, and we will try and respond to all of your questions. Yasmin, you are an inspiration. Your lecture was incredibly heartfelt and inspiring and informative, and we thank you deeply. I think we've come to the end of it. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks from the Stellenbosch University Faculty of Law, Prof. Nicholas Smith, Prof. Tuli Maransela, Yasmin Suka. Guys, thank you very much for joining us, and all the best. Please be safe, look after yourselves and each other. Good night. Oh, please grab refreshments in the foyer. There's some food and snacks as well as drinks. Please make yourselves at home and comfortable. Thank you.